This webinar is on the topic of academic freedom in the age of Trump. So to start with an outline, I'm going to begin with an overview of the AAUP's definition of academic freedom, and then I want to talk about some very specific recent attacks on academic freedom in the various parts that are identified in that definition, particularly in the classroom, research and publication, extramural speech particularly, and I'll have a little bit to say about the role of intramural speech in that context as well. And then at that will be the point where we'll stop for questions when we're done with that part of the presentation. And then I want to talk more about a broader view of institutions that are under attack that exist also to protect academic freedom. And then I want to say a little bit about things that you can do to defend academic freedom. To start out with, this is a definition of academic freedom that enumerates the separate parts. There are 4 parts. So academic freedom is the freedom to teach, both in and outside the classroom, to conduct research and to publish the results of that research, to address any matter of institutional policy or action, whether or not as a member or an agency of institutional governance. And I want to stop for a moment and say these are sort of 3 elements that are often enumerated: teaching, research, and participation in institutional governance. And then there's a 4th component, and that is to address the larger community with regard to any matter of social, political, economic, or other interest without institutional discipline or restraint, safe in response to fundamental violations of professional ethics or statements that suggest disciplinary incompetence. So this is a 4th element of academic freedom. And certainly in your faculty handbooks or collective bargaining agreements, there should be a definition of academic freedom that recognizes all 4 of these elements of academic freedom explicitly. It is important to recognize why there should be such a thing as academic freedom. This quote is from the 1940 Statement of Principles, which is the central policy statement of the AAUP on academic freedom and tenure. And it was jointly formulated between the AAUP and what is now the AAC&U and has been endorsed by more than 250 scholarly and educational groups. And it says that institutions of higher education are conducted for the common good and not to further the interest of either the individual teacher or the institution as a whole. And the common good depends upon the free search for truth and its free exposition. And already at this point, it's probably clear how, in an era of alternative facts, the mission of the university can be in conflict with the prevailing political climate. And in fact, that political climate has exacerbated a climate that was already inimical to academic freedom. And I think it's fair to say that attacks that we're seeing on academic freedom and on higher education seem to be part of a larger pattern of attacks on science, on the free press, and on others who produce knowledge. And the extent to which, after the president declared parts of the press enemies of the American people, the faculty were included in that sentiment can be seen by what very recently Education Secretary Betsy DeVos said about the faculty, which is that when she was speaking to students, that the faculty, from adjunct professors to deans, tell you what to do, what to say, and more ominously, what to think. I'm going to go through the 4 constitutive elements of academic freedom. I'm going to say a little bit about how, under AAUP policy, what they're considered to consist of, what are some recognized limitations on these freedoms, and then I want to outline some very specific attacks that are in the context of these of these parts of academic freedom. So the freedom in the classroom generally is considered to consist of choice of course materials, the preparation of the syllabus, the conduct of class meetings, assignment of grades. All of those are seen as important elements of freedom in the classroom. Um, Again, just like all parts of academic freedom, it's not an unlimited freedom to do just anything. Uh, um, Both institutional course descriptions and disciplinary norms limit this freedom in a variety of ways. And more generally, the faculty's collective academic freedom and responsibility for the curriculum as a whole uh, um, is at times at conflict with the individual academic freedom of a faculty member, and so there are varieties of ways in which those at times have to be settled. But generally speaking, these are the elements, and governance channels are in the end used to address ways in which they can conflict these different elements of academic freedom. And so the climate that we find ourselves in involves broadly legislative and gubernatorial attacks on individual faculty members, on course offerings, on governing boards, on tenure, on the institutional autonomy of colleges and universities. Um, a specific example recently of an attack on freedom in the classroom was an instance of a Wisconsin legislator who threatened to curtail funding for the University of Wisconsin because it was offering a course with the title The Problem of Whiteness. Um, Other examples of recent challenges to freedom in the classroom include the professor watch list and then targeted harassment of faculty members more generally. For those of you who are not familiar with the professor watch list, very briefly, it's a website that was put up shortly after the election this past November. It basically is a list on which individual faculty members are listed who this organization thinks are somehow promoting left-wing propaganda, and I will go more specifically into their stated cause and how that stated cause compares to what they're actually doing. But it also links then from those websites to news stories and sometimes to websites that are maintained by conservative student reporters that give outlines of descriptions of what a particular professor is reported to have done that are the cause for being added to this professor watch list. Going on other challenges to freedom in the classroom, we specifically see in a number of instances of surreptitious recordings of faculty members speaking in the classroom, which have at times been edited to omit or distort context and then posted online. And just as with some of these reports that the professor watch list uses, these reports themselves have frequently led to those individual faculty members being harassed with hundreds of emails threatening physical harm to them, threatening sexual assault, especially to female faculty members. And so we certainly view them as a significant threat to academic freedom. More specifically about the professor watch list, it has as its stated goal that they list professors who discriminate against conservative students and who advance leftist propaganda in the classroom. In the first version of that website, it actually also included promoting un-American ideas, just to sort of get the full flavor of McCarthyism going. In this case, that was later just reduced to these two elements. And I want to stay with that particular stated goal for a little bit because I think it's important. So the first thing to say about it is So they make a very specific claim about who they list. They list faculty who discriminate against conservative students and who advance leftist propaganda in the classroom. Now, the first thing to say about that is that certainly the AAUP's definition of academic freedom uh, um, does not include discriminating against any students on the basis of their political beliefs, um, or for that matter, propagandizing in the classroom. But the question is to what extent the instances that they report really fall under that. Um, um, and A particularly important statement around that topic, which is called freedom in the classroom, particularly points out that in some cases, criticizing or analyzing a statement that a student has made can be characterized as harassment when it really is not harassment. And so in particular, that statement notes that assuming that students have the right not to have their most cherished beliefs challenged contradicts the central purpose of higher education, which is to challenge students to think hard about their own perspectives, whatever those might be, and that it is neither harassment nor discriminatory treatment of a student to hold up to close criticism an idea or viewpoint the student has posited or advanced. So that's sort of one element, which is that sometimes faculty engaging in criticism are accused of harassment. And then there are other aspects to what they claim to do that I will go through here in greater detail. And this here is very briefly simply further clarifying that the AAUP's definition of academic freedom most certainly does not either allow for discriminating against students on the basis of their political beliefs or um, propagandizing in the classroom. These are quotes from the Statement on Professional Ethics that faculty should encourage the free pursuit of learning in students. They should demonstrate respect for students as individuals, act as intellectual guides and counselors, and avoid exploitation, harassment, or discriminatory treatment. And it is also important to recognize here that, to the best of my knowledge, certainly every university in the United States has mechanisms for students to complain to the administration if they believe that students have been discriminated against on the basis of their political beliefs. And so again, that also raises the question why there is a need for a website to somehow collect instances that, again, I will go through in greater detail, aren't always necessarily instances of what they purport to be. Moving on to freedom of research and publication. That is typically just taken to be the freedom to pursue research and to publish the results of that research. Again, just as academic freedom in the classroom has certain kinds of limitations, freedom of research and publication have certain kinds of limitations as well, particularly professional ethics and disciplinary norms, including peer review. So having a paper rejected from a journal is not a violation of one's academic freedom because we accept that peer review in a way places limitations on academic freedom. IRBs are also a particular way in which freedom of research is limited as well. So these are different things that in different ways in which academic freedom of research is limited. When you look historically at in what areas people have been subject to limitations or threats depending on their areas of research, it's interesting to look historically at what these areas have been. When the AAUP was founded 100 years ago, economics was one of the most threatened disciplines. Sociology was then and continues to be with us. Area studies, ethnic studies, gender studies have all been subject to a fair amount of scrutiny. Climate science and fetal tissue research are certainly very likely to be, again, subject to a fair amount of scrutiny here. A particular way in which freedom of research is also attacked is through the harassment of faculty members by the use of Freedom of Information Act requests. And those have been very specifically targeting specific areas of research, labor studies, but also specifically climate science. This is a statistical analysis, and you have the source down there. It's by a researcher by the name of Marion Leary, who in the Huffington Post did a statistical analysis of the professor watch list. I had to do a little bit of massaging of this, and I can very briefly say what I had to do. Because in each case, the report on the professor watch list is to frequently a student-written article about the faculty member. These aren't typically, they don't identify home departments in a uniform way. They will sometimes be, a literature professor, and it isn't necessarily clear in what area. So the analysis that Leary did was based on what was reported in these news sources, and I had to combine them in a few places. But simply to say that about 2/3, some 62 or so percent, fall into these areas: history, English American literature, women's studies, ethnic studies, political science, communication, sociology, social work, law, psychology, philosophy, and education. And in some of them, where I had to combine them, it was because they were in those reports combined, and it was not clear in what particular area they were. Moving on, after talking about freedom of academic freedom in the classroom and in research, I'm moving on now to the third element, which is intramural utterance, which we generally use as a term for speech on matters of institutional governance. And the AAUP has recommended for some time now that speaking on matters of institutional governance should be enumerated explicitly as an element of academic freedom in faculty handbooks or collective bargaining agreements. And one of the reasons specifically, and I alluded to this earlier, that we recommend this is because of potential challenges in the context of the Garcetti decision, which, without going in all detail of this, it's simply it was a decision that limited First Amendment protection of public sector employees, and it raised significant concerns on our end that this could be used to discipline faculty who criticized the administration, and that they could no longer then use First Amendment protection for that. And for that reason, we urge faculty to work towards including, specifically speaking on matters of academic governance, as an element of academic freedom in institutional regulations and collective bargaining agreements. I don't have a very specific example here of recent attacks on intramural utterance specifically, although we actually have certainly historically our investigations have very frequently involved cases of dismissals because of speech on matters of governance. But it is very important to recognize what the relationship is between speaking on matters of governance and the defense of academic freedom, or more generally between it and academic freedom. On the one hand, speaking on matters of governance, as you can see here, is enumerated as an element of academic freedom. But on the other hand, participating in governance is needed to defend academic freedom, because ultimately decisions about faculty personnel matters, which are really one of the main ways in which academic freedom is limited, or is one of the most serious ways in which academic freedom is attacked, ought to be done, these decisions ought to be made by faculty primarily, and that's one of the ways in which academic freedom is supposed to be defended in this context. And now moving on to the fourth element, which is extramural utterance. So extramural utterance is the freedom to address the larger community with regard to any matter of social, political, economic, or other interest without institutional discipline or restraint. Um, that's a very important element of academic freedom. It's also probably the most controversial among the four parts of the definition of academic freedom, because if you look, teaching, research, and participation in governance are directly related to your expertise as faculty members. This freedom is not. It's a freedom to speak on matters of public concern, and it's not directly related to your position as faculty members. It is an element, though, that is included in the AAUP's definition and has historically been included. To some extent, this goes back to the AAUP's founding and the fact that during the progressive era when the AAUP was founded, this was an era when social scientists wanted to be engaged in public debates over the direction in which the country was heading, and frequently for their troubles were dismissed. And because that was a particularly important issue for the founders of the AAUP, they explicitly included extramural utterance as an element of the definition of academic freedom. It is most likely unique to the United States. Most other definitions of academic freedom from other countries that I'm aware of do not explicitly include extramural utterance as an element of academic freedom. There are limitations to extramural utterance, and the important element that the AAUP always stresses is that in order for an extramural utterance to give rise to dismissal or be grounds for dismissal or major sanction, um, it needs to clearly demonstrate the faculty member's unfitness for his or her position. And again, under principles of academic due process, it should be reviewed by a faculty body that should have the primary responsibility for making the determination whether or not a specific extramural utterance um, 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 does question the fitness of a faculty member. One of the most notorious recent violations of academic freedom in the area of extramural utterance was the dismissal of Stephen Zelida from his tenured appointment at the University of Illinois over tweets that condemned the Gaza war in strong terms, and the AAUP subsequently censured the University of Illinois at Champaign. A more recent example was over Christmas when a professor of Drexel University tweeted in a way in which he was mocking the concept of white genocide, and over that tweet was subject to extensive online harassment, death threats, and calls for his dismissal to the institution. And he was not subsequently dismissed or sanctioned in any way, but it still raised questions about the effect certainly on his academic freedom to speak. And I think there were also concerns about the rather weak response of the institution in terms certainly of its initial response, which at least to many, including to him, seemed insufficiently supportive. And that is something I want to say a little bit about, which is the responsibility of administrations and boards to speak in defense of academic freedom of the faculty at the institution, including the role, of course, also of the faculty itself to speak in defense of academic freedom. This is another example here of the use of Freedom of Information Act requests to harass a faculty member. In this case, this is also an instance of extramural speech because it was a professor who signed a letter opposing the appointment of Jeff Sessions for Attorney General. This is, so going back to the definition of the professor watch list, claiming that what it does is listing professors who discriminate against conservative students and listing professors who propagandize in the classroom. So this is again using the same analysis by Leary. Notice that, so again, I've combined some of the reported data by Leary here, but notice that again the claim is that this is a very specific one. What they do, discrimination against students and propagandizing in the classroom. Barely more than half of the reports actually occur in class or on campus, and the full 16% are specifically social media blogs, with another 16%. You couldn't tell from the report where the utterance occurred, but it does seem, and only 1% actually being directly about research. It is noticeable here that extramural utterance in particular of faculty seems to be one of the targets, and it is clearly at odds with claims about what the professor watch list purports to do. We have time now for some questions, and so Irene is going to jump in and field some of the questions.
Yep. Hi, everybody. So there are a couple of questions to address. The first one Bethany wrote at the beginning was, to what extent, the way I'd frame this question for Jorg to answer is, to what extent does academic freedom apply to social media? And Bethany has asked in particular about her role updating and maintaining a department's Facebook page, but I think there's also the same question could be asked about to what extent does academic freedom apply to social media when it's your own personal page? So, Jorg, do you want to answer that?
Want me to field those? I'm certainly happy to. So, I mean, regarding the first one, I mean, if it is your own social media page, then we have a statement on academic freedom and electronic communication, which very clearly outlines that that is simply part of any other kind of extramural utterance. So there's no difference between social media in terms of what restrictions we would recognize to other kinds of extramural utterance, writing an editorial or speaking in public on a matter of public concern. I mean, when writing on behalf of the department, it's a little bit more tricky, I mean, I would assume that some kind of restrictions there, they should really then be subject to governance issues at the university. If the faculty wants to establish certain limitations in terms of how one might speak on behalf of the department on such a site, I think that's a different matter, and those restrictions should then really come through governance channels. I'll leave it at that, and I'm just seeing we have about 2 more minutes for questions.
Okay, the second I noted this. I was going to ask you to address AAUP's position on surreptitious recording in the classroom, and then Lisa Richmond asked this question, which is a similar thing. So, do you want to address that?
So, I mean, our position is that institutions should adopt regulations prohibiting surreptitious recording. I'm not an attorney, and nothing I can say here is legal advice, and certainly not legal advice specific to the situation in Illinois. Whether if by law in Illinois students have that right, can public institutions still choose to prohibit it? I'm unfortunately not in a position to give you a definitive answer. And you say that it's a private institution. Having taught at a private institution in Illinois myself, I certainly was aware of colleagues who specifically put on their syllabus that surreptitious recording was not allowed in their classes. But I cannot answer whether whether there could be legal challenges to that. And finally, I'll say, of course, that my understanding of the Americans with Disabilities Act would be, of course, if a student requests as a reasonable accommodation to record it because of a disability, that's of course different, but that's also not surreptitious. So the rest of the presentation is a somewhat broader view about what institutions protect academic freedom and how are they affected by a number of recent attacks. And then I have a few things about suggestions what you can do to help protect academic freedom. So I want to outline, and this goes back to Robert's question here. Um, um, what are some institutions that are needed for the defense of academic freedom? So there is, on the one hand, and I already mentioned the role that institutional governance plays um, um, for, especially the faculty's role in institutional governance for the defense of academic freedom. And I'll have here in a moment also some information about the role of the governing board. And then more generally, academic due process as a way in which there are procedural safeguards for tenured and untenured faculty members that helps defend academic freedom. And then finally, of course, the institution of tenure. The AAUP has always put forth that the institution of tenure exists specifically um, um, to defend academic freedom by protecting against dismissal without adequate cause. This is a quote from our statement on government of colleges and universities that outlines the role of the governing board, particularly in defense of academic freedom. It says that when ignorance or ill will threatens the institution or any part of it, the governing board must be available for support. In grave crises, it will be expected to serve as a champion, although the action to be taken by it will usually be on behalf of the president, the faculty, or the student body. The board should make clear that the protection it offers to an individual or a group is in fact a fundamental defense of the vested interests of society in the educational institution. And so I want to point to two very specific ways in which institutional autonomy has been attacked. There was, on the one hand, so both of them involve the selection of members of governing boards. And given the important role that governing boards play in the defense of institutional autonomy, these are instances of politicizing the selection of public board members. And because of the role of public board members, that politicization is threatens academic freedom. One example is at the University of Louisville, which is the bottom headline there. Um, um, First, the governor removed all the members of the board, and when he found in court that he couldn't, then subsequently the legislature did so for him. And in the case of North Carolina, the issue was that, as you might remember, there was a very hard-fought election for governor. And when in the end it turned out that a Democrat was elected governor, almost immediately the legislature, which is Republican controlled, removed a variety of authorities from the governor, including the authority to appoint members of the North Carolina System Board. Now, the AAUP does not have a specific position whether governing board members should be appointed by the governor or by the legislature, but what is disconcerting here is that um, changing the mechanism immediately after somebody of a different party is elected governor suggests that the main concern of the North Carolina legislature is not to try to find the most qualified individuals to serve as members of the North Carolina System Board, but instead that there could be political considerations, and to that extent, to the extent that the role of the board, especially of a public board, is to insulate the institution from political interference and to uphold institutional autonomy. This process of politicization constitutes a threat to academic freedom. And now, again, continuing on with Robert's question, this indicates the extent to which the faculty has become much more contingent over the last several decades, and so a decreasing percentage of faculty members are tenured or eligible for tenure, and so tenure has really been under attack now for decades. And to add to that, uh, um, due process protections of contingent faculty members is in many institutions weaker than even for untenured tenure track faculty members. And so speaking back to Robert's question, certainly one of the main things that the AUP would strongly urge would be to enhance protections, sort of basic protections of academic due process for full-time and part-time faculty on contingent appointments. That's really an essential way to protect the academic freedom of faculty in general. But while tenure has now been under attack for some time, the most recent legislative attacks on tenure really have taken the form of full-on assaults. There's proposed legislation in Iowa and Missouri that explicitly prohibits public institutions from having tenure systems at all. And in the case of Iowa, I believe it would also remove it from faculty who currently uh, uh, who currently have it. So this was simply now, enumerating ways in which um, institutions that we believe are needed for the defense of academic freedom are also under attack. And I do want to maybe say here for a moment that getting back to the beginning of the presentation, I do think there is reason to conclude that these institutions are not just necessarily under attack for their own sake, but because they defend academic freedom. That is, it's really and ultimately the role that higher education plays in the defense of our democracy, that's in fact the reason why these institutions under such heavy attack most recently. Generally, um, one of the ways, an important way to defend academic freedom is by including um, AAUP policy statements from the Red Book in your collective bargaining agreement or faculty handbook. And I want to point out specifically the recommended institutional regulations on academic freedom and tenure, which is a statement that is designed to be incorporated verbatim into your institutional regulations. I know this is almost banal, but I have had many conversations recently about how the current political climate can cause one to withdraw, and so I do want to stress the importance of serving on institutional governance bodies and in the leadership of your chapter for the defense of academic freedom. I already talked at length about the role of institutional governance bodies and the faculty in the defense of academic freedom. It's simply to stress in this context the central importance of that kind of engagement. It is important to speak out individually and collectively through these governance bodies or an AUP chapter when there are threats to academic freedom on your campus. So when you find a colleague to be subject to targeted harassment, or when there are calls to rescind invitations of a speaker, even one that we strongly disagree with their views, or if there are instances of censorship of art, poetry, or student newspapers on your campus. All of those are when they occur, very, very important opportunities to speak out publicly in the defense of academic freedom. This is a very general comment and or suggestion, and I think that it is in general very, very important to seek opportunities to educate members of the academic community, and that's an activity that a chapter can be engaged in. That's an activity that governance bodies can be engaged in to talk more to your faculty colleagues, but also to administrators, and in some cases, perhaps it's possible to include board members to talk to them about what are their roles in the defense of academic freedom and what are their roles in shared governance generally. I'll say specifically about governing board members that we have a statement on faculty board communication that you might want to look at that talks more generally about structuring the way in which the faculty and the board can communicate directly, and that includes participation in board orientation meetings, which would be an opportunity to talk about those kinds of issues. You could write an op-ed about the importance of academic freedom to the education of students and to society at large. You can talk to your students about the importance of academic freedom to their education and to society at large. And I mean, I'll say, for instance, the example that I had about speaking out against instances of censorship or of art or student newspapers, that's certainly a particular instance that I had some dealings with on my own campus, where there was a case of censoring a student poet at an event where the faculty spoke out very strongly, but then also used it as an opportunity to educate the students more generally that, for instance, the fact that we had tenure allowed us to advocate on their behalf without fearing retribution, and explaining these kinds of mechanisms, I think, is an important thing to do, and I think something that we don't do enough. You can contact your elected representatives to express opposition to legislative attacks on academic freedom and higher education more generally. And you can participate in our digital organizing efforts by sharing petitions, news, action items, graphics that we send you via email, or you can access them through our Facebook or our Twitter page. And that lets more people know about the activities that the AAUP is engaged in. And then I will end with a quote by AAUP founder Arthur Lovejoy, which I think is particularly relevant to our current discussion, which is that freedom of teaching, like most of the other forms of desirable freedom, is unlikely to be won or kept unless those who are its natural guardians possess a certain measure of civil courage. That concludes this presentation.